the board standard was that we would we would not have any debt. We would have either gifts or pledges to pay for everything we were going to do. And the guy doing the contractor doing the transitional housing subdivision had said, I can do this a lot more efficiently if you let me work on all these houses at once. And the money was coming in so rapidly, I said, sure, go ahead. We'll have it when you're ready to get a check. And then the recession hit and everything dried up. And immediately I created about $1 million worth of debt that I didn't have any gifts or pledges for, and in violation of the board's policy. But more than that, everything, we were just struggling in every way at every location, and I was convinced I would have to close one or more of our ministry facilities.
And welcome to Miracles from the Hill podcast, where we share raw stories that display the anatomy of God's grace here at Miracle Hill Ministries. If this is your first time joining us, please subscribe. And of course, you can like, comment, and leave a review. To connect with us, visit our website linked in the description box. And now, here is our host, Ryan Dirk.
Hello, faithful listeners, viewers, new listeners and viewers. Welcome to the Miracles from the Hill podcast. We are on the second part of our very first two-part interview with Reid Layman, past president and ministry consultant, faithful Miracle Hill leader for decades and decades, dynamite expert. If you want to learn about that, you got to listen to the first of this two-part series. So we're going to jump back in where we left off. But if somebody's listening to this for the first time, we don't want them to not know who you are. Yeah. So pretend like we just met on an escalator in the mall. Who are you?
I led a ministry to the homeless in Greenville, South Carolina for 32 years. And now I'm like Johnny Appleseed, helping spread ministries like that across the Southeast.
Well, thank you, sir, for sharing your time with us and for sharing your experience and your story. Certainly, I am personally grateful to you on a million different levels, which we'll probably get into at some point. So let's do a quick summary of where we are in your story. We've gone all the way through your youth, growing up at the children's home. You've been to college. You've gotten married. You've made the unbelievably difficult decision to leave the ministry. You went to Miami to work for a lumberyard of all places. And now we are back in Greenville. You're still working for the lumberyard, but your wife hears the call before you do to come back to the ministry. So what year are we in? How old are you?
It's 1980. January of 1980 is when I come back. I was born in 54, so that would make me
36.
26. So, just a young fella.
So you come back, you ask your dad if he would allow you to come back into the ministry. He agrees. And so when you come back, what's your position? What does Miracle look like in 1980? And what are you spending your days doing?
In 1980, we have the children's home up near Pumpkintown. We have the rescue mission, which is moved from down by the depot to a better building at about 571 West Washington Street. It's a converted bus garage and has about 80 beds for men and 60 beds for men and probably 10 or 11 for women and children. And then we have a single thrift store, which is the location right now we have over at Pete Hollis Boulevard. We're still living in a lot of poverty, but Miracle Hill is doing reasonably well. Dad needed some help with leadership. I was brought back as the director of the Greenville Rescue Mission, which position for which I was very unqualified, but didn't know that until I got started.
Okay, so unpack that. What made you unqualified?
I really, even though I'd grown up in the ministry and understood our culture and God's call, I didn't know anything about homelessness per se. I didn't know anything about addiction per se. Didn't really know much about leading a residential adult program. I'd been in the children's home and knew a lot more about children. And we had a mission guest at the time who was answering the phones at the front desk, and his name was Wyvon Davis. He was an alcoholic, and when he was sober, he was a cab driver. And Mr. Davis really grew me into my role as the mission director. And so I would make decisions throughout the day. He would accept the decision and do whatever I asked to do, and then he'd come back when no one else was around. He would say, "Mr. Reid, I know you know what you're doing and all, but if I were you, I would have done this other thing instead." And I was wise enough to realize that was a lot of wisdom there. And so he coached me on what I should or shouldn't be doing. And I grew tremendously under his leadership.
Wow. What happened to Mr. Davis?
He had varying degrees of success. And his daughter, he was an alcoholic. His daughter was growing up without him. And finally, when she was 15 and she was getting into trouble, that gave him the incentive that he needed to stay clean. He was following Christ as best he knew, but he decided to move out and take in his daughter and raise her and stay clean. And he had 2 or 3 years with her before he died of a heart attack, but it was just enough to give his daughter the start she needed.
Wow. Have you heard from her in all these years?
No, I haven't. I'd love to hear what happened next for her.
Well, if anybody knows her, please tell them to get in touch with us. We'll connect her with Reid.
I'd love to talk to her.
So, 42 years ago, what was a day in the mission like?
We didn't have an addiction recovery program, so I and other staff would spend time just discipling people one-on-one, and so I would try to do several people at a time, but couldn't do too many. We allowed smoking only in the living rooms of the building, but the whole building was permeated with smoke, and the offices are right above the men's living room. So I'd come home every night just completely reeking of smoke. Everyone had to wear suits and ties to work. Ladies had to wear hose, and the air conditioner went out for the offices in the beginning of August, and we didn't have the money to fix it, but we thought surely we can hang on until cooler weather comes. And boy, was that a miserable August. It was really a very difficult month to get through, but we made it through somehow.
So let the record show this was 42 years ago, and we've evolved a lot since then. When you said everybody had to wear suits and ties, who do you mean everybody?
Well, all the staff that worked in the offices had to wear suits and ties. The clients didn't have to wear suits and ties, but they had to have a haircut the day they came into care. They couldn't have beards. They couldn't have mustaches. They couldn't wear shorts. They couldn't wear sandals, and they couldn't wear T-shirts. They had to wear a collared shirt.
So they came off the streets and went to the Miracle Hill boot camp to look the part, even if they didn't want to live the part.
We had a staff member who was also a barber, and he got their hair cut right away, got them all straightened up. They could have passed muster at the Bob Jones Chapel, which is where I had been not too very long ago.
Wow. And so when you said you and other staff members were discipling these people, what does that mean to you? What were you doing? What was discipleship?
I would look carefully at our guests, and I would go to one and say, "Would you consider doing a Bible study with me? No cost, maybe an hour a week. We'll just start maybe with the book of Matthew and start studying the Bible together, and then we would meet weekly, and over time, I bet we met weekly for 3 or 4 years. And I remember doing it with Red Owens, and the first time we met, I asked if he was a Christian. He said, "Oh yes, I'm a Baptist. I've always been a Christian." In spite of the fact that he'd spent years in prison for killing people, and he'd killed other people that nobody knew about, and he'd taken a contract to kill someone right before coming to the mission. So it was 3 or 4 weeks before he got lost enough to get saved, but he came to one of our Bible studies and said, "Since our last meeting, I've asked Jesus into my heart."
There's this great comparison here, what you're talking about, right? So Christianity is permeated with a lot of religion, right? So you and I would both believe that religion is this man-made idea, and what really matters is relationship, which even back in 1980 and prior to that, at the children's home and in other ministry ventures, relationship is kind of the name of the game, right? So it doesn't really matter how much you know about the Bible if you're not willing to get down in the ditch with somebody. And so you were doing that even back then, which I'm sure was strange to you, having grown up at the children's home, and now here you find yourself with, using 1980 terms, winos and drug addicts and broken human beings engaged in these Bible studies. Was that a hard transition?
No, I mean, I'd been in and out of the mission all of my life, and so I was very comfortable with the folks that we cared for there. And so it was just a matter of being deliberate. It never dawned on me that maybe we should be deliberate with classes, specifically focused on personal growth. We did have, of course, devotions twice a day and every day, but those were more often just, different people coming in and maybe, the men hearing about the prodigal son 7 or 8 times in the same week sometimes, because nobody was coordinating with anybody else about what was going to be taught. I will say that in that first year, I recruited some other folks my age, also in their 20s, who I thought had good energy and would help bring change to the Miracle Hill. And we thought that if we just did all the right things, that a lot of people would have their lives changed. And we had prayer meetings and we did the right things. And a year later, we couldn't identify a single life we thought was any better at all. And we were all really discouraged. And I remember in our prayer meetings, we were just crying out to the Lord, please just give us one. If you're really calling us to do this work, would you just give us one person to show that it's worth doing, that something good is going to happen out of it? And I think we weren't conscious of it. Well, we started with arrogance. So we were smart enough and we knew the Bible well enough. And if you just follow this formula, people will change. But most change comes about in relationship. And we weren't very good at relationship back then. But I think God also wanted to remind us it wasn't our efforts. It was what he did.
So, for those that are listening that know you, they know this amazing, humble leader. But God's been chiseling things off you all these years as well.
Well, I am really amazing and really humble.
So, I remember one story that would get you arrested today, which winds up with you with somebody by their ankle dragging them down a hall. Tell us what happened.
As a young man, I had a lot of problems with anger, and if you told me I had an anger problem, it would have made me mad. I remember, even as a college student, something would go wrong at the shop, and I would kick in a trash can. Or I remember once I'd fixed a mower 7 or 8 times, and every time it came back with another problem, and finally I just picked up a sledgehammer and beat it to death. But I had an anger problem, and it manifested itself probably more at home than at work. But at work, I'll give you 2 examples. One was I went to the front desk to get an aspirin one day. I had a headache, and anyone could go, client or guest or staff person could go. But the aspirin came with a childproof top, and I couldn't get the top off. And I tried, and I tried, and I tried. Finally, I laid it flat on the desk, hit it with my fist, sent aspirin all over the room, took out 2, said thank you, and walked away. And as you can imagine, that's setting a wonderful example for the people that I'm there to serve. But the issue you're talking about, there was a guest that was really very skilled at manipulation. And we had asked him to leave, and a local pastor had called and given us the name of someone he wanted us to help. And we said that we would help him, and he brought them in. And it was the same person we had just asked to leave who had given a false name to the pastor. And the pastor brought him back, and we, said thank you, and we kept him, and the pastor left. And then I took the man to my office, and I was yelling at him, and then I was shaking him, and I picked him up to shake him more, and he fell down, and I grabbed him by the legs and drug him down the hall and around the front door and bounced him out on the sidewalk. And he was laying there holding onto his back, complaining, and I said, quit your faking, just get out of here. Of course, I would terminate anyone who would have done that 5 years later, but
Right.
at the time, I was a pretty faulty vessel.
Wow. Yeah, it's almost impossible for me to imagine you doing that. It seems so out of character. But praise the Lord for what he does in our lives, right?
Yeah.
To change us. Tell the folks listening about my favorite story about Little Bit.
So it was August 1st. It was a sweltering day. It was, I think, midday or early afternoon. And the desk man came back to the office. I was just around the corner from the desk, about 30, 40 feet. And he said, there's a lady that's been hit by a car and she's laying in the street, and what should we do? And I said, well, call 911. And I jumped up and rushed out of there, and West Washington Street is a 4-lane road, and cars were backed up already on both sides, and she was laying right out there sort of in the median, right in the middle of the 4 lanes. And there was a crowd gathered, but nobody was doing anything for her. And I got to her, and I recognized her. Her name was Little Bit, and she was about 4.5 feet tall. I was, like 20, probably 35, 30, 31, 32. She was in her 60s. She had no teeth. She was mentally ill. She was, and if you ever stopped even to talk to her, she'd curse you out and scream at you and maybe go to attack you. And so we all could almost never serve her at the mission. Once in a while, on a really cold night, she might come in, but usually you couldn't do anything with her. But she was laid out there, and I bent over her, and she had been drinking heavily that day, and she'd lost whatever she had on her stomach not long ago, and I couldn't tell that she was breathing. And I said, Lord, I don't want to do this. And then I tilted her head up, pulled her neck up, and tilted her head back, and began giving her mouth to mouth. And while I was doing that, it turned out she had not been hit by a car. She was simply passed out. And she woke up to me kissing on her. And she just began frantically beating me around the head and shoulders. And I extricated myself as quickly as I could and pulled away. And she jumped up and cursed me out and cursed everybody out all around. And then she stomped off. And I went back into the mission, and I gargled and I choked and I brushed my teeth and tried to get that taste out of my mouth. And it was my wedding anniversary, and I couldn't have a kiss on my wedding anniversary. My wife said that lips
Barbara
that touch
said
Little Bit
no.
will never touch mine.
Oh man, that's such a good story.
So, I did not want to start mouth to mouth. I tell you that.
So I want to get to kind of the transition to CEO here in a minute.
Yeah.
But in those early years in the Greenville Rescue Mission, what were the things that you learned about who you were, or maybe some mistakes that you made that helped shape you, as God was preparing to call you to a deeper level of leadership?
Let me start with a couple of things that I learned, and then maybe some mistakes that I made. But one of the best lessons I ever learned was that if you don't have enough faith to do the work God's calling you to do, act like you do. And I'm not saying that in defense of hypocrisy or in defense of pretending, but there were times when I was just completely overwhelmed, and I knew that I didn't have enough faith to do it. When my father died and I took over, I wasn't ready to take over. I thought I was until he died, and then I realized I clearly wasn't. But I did know if Dad was alive and he was the person of faith, and what would he do? And I thought, well, at least I can do what he would do. It's probably not going to work because God's not going to listen to my prayer the way he would listen to Dad's prayer. But I'll do what a person of faith would do and see what God does. And time after time, even when I've had this hopeless feeling and the sense that it couldn't possibly work, God did really good things. And I didn't have enough faith, but I was doing what I would have done if I had had enough faith.
Arguably, that is you having enough faith, though, right? You didn't mentally feel like you had enough faith, but you walked in it, which by definition would be having enough faith. And maybe your faith was in Gerald rather than Jesus.
No, I don't think I was. He was dead. I don't think I was trusting him anymore. But yeah, I do think back then that's not how I understood faith. Faith, bravery is not an absence of fear. Bravery is acting in spite of the fear. Faith is not an absence of doubt. It's doing what you know you're supposed to do, believing that somehow God's going to make you glad you did do that. And so I would just encourage that for those of you who are facing your own giants or challenges. If you can imagine what a person of faith would do, why don't you try doing that and just hold on and see what God will do for you.
That's a good word.
So some mistakes that I made along the way. Another lesson I learned before I get to the mistake, another lesson I learned was that whenever we were starting to do something new, we would ask ourselves, what can we afford? And we couldn't really afford anything. So what we did was haphazard and very cheaply done and not very energy efficient and not very pretty, but it may allow us to care for a few more people. And one day, and I don't remember how we came up with this, but we had a ladies' auxiliary that was committed to doing things really nice, and maybe I learned from them. But we decided if money wasn't the problem, what would be the ideal solution? What would be the ideal location, the ideal building, the ideal furniture, the ideal staffing? Although we didn't learn the staffing lesson right away. What would be the ideal solution? And we found out money was never the problem. It was a lack of vision and a lack of willingness to wait. If God's in this, can he do it nicely with quality? And are we willing to wait until we see him do it that way? And once we were able to set a vision and wait on the Lord, he did some amazing things. The Miracle Hill that you walk in today in any of our facilities, it's beautiful. And it's energy efficient and attractive. But if you'd have walked into our facilities back then, you'd expect them to look just like a rescue mission would expect to look. So some mistakes. One is that, and I didn't have a good set of boundaries in those early years, and I didn't have an understanding that I had to put my family as a high priority. So I remember the night that I took Joe Brown home to spend the night and made my family leave. I sent Barbara and our two little boys to stay with Miss May for the night, and I took Joe Brown home to save him. He was a college graduate. He held responsible positions at major construction companies, supervising hundreds of men, but he was an alcoholic, and he started drinking one day, and we had to leave the mission, but I couldn't bear to send him back on the street, so I took him home. And he got thirsty again, and I wrestled with him and kept him there and hid his beer in the woods. And it was a long night, but somehow we made it through, and the next morning we'd won the victory, and I took him back to town, and I got the van driver to take him to a boarding house, and he had some money that we could spend to have a place to stay because he wasn't eligible to come back to the mission yet, but we'd won the victory. And he stopped at the liquor store on the way to the boarding house. And I had sent my family away and just essentially said that this guy's more important than you are. And that was the last time I did that. And I realized that I was a workaholic, and I was putting the work, the ministry, ahead of the family. And how could Barbara argue with God? How could she argue that God wasn't more important than she was? But I was defining how that worked, and I had other friends leading other ministries that later on got divorced because they never woke up to the fact that they had to put their family as a high priority.
I'm the recipient of much of your wisdom that you've learned from making mistakes. That particular piece of wisdom that when I received it, or me and Lauren received it, we didn't actually get it from you. We got it from Barbara, who very specifically, told Lauren it's real easy to sacrifice your life on the altar of ministry, and you got to constantly be checking that boundary to make sure that your family, or Ryan is making sure that his family, which is his first ministry, takes priority over this other ministry.
And when Lauren reminds you of that, does it ever irritate you a little bit?
This is not said in any level of pride. She's only had to remind me once or twice, and it doesn't make me mad because she's right. And, even when we train new employees at Miracle Hill, we talk about that, valuing the family. Mm-hmm. And I say to the new staff members, your family's your first ministry, and take all your vacation time, take all your holiday time. If you're working 60 or 70 hours, don't tell me about it, because I'm going to correct you and tell you that you're working too much and you need to spend time with your family. So that mistake or that lesson that you learned permeates throughout the ministry today. And certainly we all violate it from time to time, but we are much more conscious of it today.
I'm so grateful. There were several families destroyed in those early days because nobody took vacations, nobody took time off. Everybody was trying to outdo everybody else, showing how committed they were. And it wasn't healthy for families.
Any other early lessons?
Yeah. We talked about how you had to, look the part of a Bible college student to come in the mission the first day. I did not set up that expectation, but I accepted it without questioning. And one day, a 17-year-old boy came in with long hair on a rainy fall day, sort of chilly, and he asked if he could stay there at the mission. And I said, sure, come down to the barber shop with me, and we'll give you a good haircut, and you can spend the night. And his eyes filled with tears, and he said, I don't mean any disrespect, mister, but I've worked hard to get my hair to this length, and I'm not willing to cut it to spend the night here. And he walked out in the rain, and I never saw him again. Never got to tell him about Jesus, never got to talk with him about what was going on in his life and what he needed. And I didn't know at the time he wasn't actually 17. He was like 14 and really big for his age. And that haunted me. And I asked myself, why am I asking all these things of our guests? Is it best for them? Not really. Does it make us look good maybe to some other Christians? Yes, it does. I'm not going to do things to look good to other Christians. I'm going to do things that I think are right for the people that I'm here to serve. And so we made some changes then and made more changes later. And even if I'm misunderstood by other Christians, I want to do what's best for our guests, regardless of how I'm viewed by other people.
So, quick story from my side. I took Lincoln, my son, on a camping trip here recently. Yeah. And first, he's 6, so it's first big camping trip, and we hiked in, and we had way too much gear. And so I had about 40 pounds on my back, and Lincoln has 10, and he makes it most of the way in, and then I got to transfer that his bag to my bag. Mm-hmm. Then we have storms coming in, and Lincoln gets a little nervous. So really long story short, he wants to hike back out. So I oblige. So I pack camp back up, and we head back out. So we're 6 or 7 miles in at this point.
Yeah.
And he gets tired from wearing his backpack, and I put his backpack on my backpack. We get about a mile away from the car, and he's hobbling. His little feet are bruised. He's holding his side. His abs hurt. He's never walked 7 miles before in his life.
Yeah.
And so I ask him if he wants me to carry him, and he declines. And then I ask him again, and eventually he says, yes, Daddy. And so I pick him up. So now I got 50 pounds on my back, and I got 50 pounds on my front. And so let me paint a picture for you. We're dirty. We're covered in sweat. This is before I trimmed my beard back down, so I've got a long beard. I'm covered in tattoos, right? I'm walking down the road with 100 pounds of child and gear on. I get passed by 5 or 6 cars. They just blow past us. The sixth or seventh car stops, and a guy gets out, and he says, "Do you need a ride?" It was actually one of those Jeeps with the bed on it.
Yeah.
And so I met Scott, and so I said, "Yes, I'd love a ride." And so I said, I'll put my pack in the back, and me and my son will jump in the back. And he says, "Absolutely not. Put the pack in the back, and then you guys get in the back seat." So Scott's got 6 earrings in each ear. Scott's got a gray beard halfway down his chest, and I get in the car with him and his wife Cheryl, and there's an odor in the car from what they've been doing throughout the day, and then Scott begins to evangelize me. He asks us if we want something to drink.
Yeah.
He begins to try to lead me to the Lord. So then I tell him, I work in the ministry and I know Jesus. And before we get out of the car and pray together, he's given my son and me these "Thank You, Jesus" bracelets that Lincoln's still wearing today. And so my point is, if I was a betting man, those 5 or 6 cars that passed us, they'd probably go to some church here in the upstate, if I was a betting man. Scott and Cheryl don't look like they go to some church here in the upstate, but you know who they look like? They look like Jesus.
Yeah, they do.
Right?
They do.
They were worried about my physical health. They were worried about my spiritual health. Mm-hmm. And they were not worried about the way that I looked. And to them, or to anybody driving by us at the time, I looked crazy. There's a wild man with a beard and tattoos and a bunch of gear and a child, and they tried to help me anyways.
Yeah.
Man, we got to learn that lesson as believers.
We do.
Right? Man, I've heard more sermons from crazy looking guys at the Mission or at the Overcomer Center that are so strong and valid by the way that they live their life, when we hear many, many men come into the shelters and the programs to preach, and it's all about how good I am and how bad you are. The different way of living life. Anyways, okay, back to your story. What's the hardest part of, in the past 30 years, what's been the hardest part of your time at Miracle Hill?
I knew that you were going to ask that question, and I've had a number of difficult times. I mean, and just the number of times I didn't know what to do. Probably one of those frightening times was when my father died and I took over, and I had no idea what to do next, and I knew how completely unqualified I was, and how kind God was to help me in that early transition. But I think maybe I'd like to talk a little bit about a time in 08-09 when we had the recession in 08-09. And Miracle Hill was in expansion mode, and we were we were running a capital campaign and building a subdivision for transitional housing, and we had just taken on the renewal program, and we were working to do a capital campaign for the Overcomer Center. And the board standard was that we would we would not have any debt. We would have either gifts or pledges to pay for everything we were going to do. And the guy doing the contractor doing the transitional housing subdivision had said, "I can do this a lot more efficiently if you let me work on all these houses at once." And the money was coming in so rapidly, I said, "Sure, go ahead. We'll have it when you're ready to get a check." And then the recession hit, and everything dried up. And immediately, I created about $1 million worth of debt that I didn't have any gifts or pledges for, and in violation of the board's policy. But more than that, everything, we were just struggling in every way at every location, and I was convinced I would have to close one or more of our ministry facilities. And every one that I went to, I would walk in the door and say, "Lord, am I supposed to close this one?" And then I would talk to people and hear from the people I was there to be with. And I kept hearing the message, "No, not this one. I'm at work here. You can't close this one." And we did a forced reduction of salary for everybody. I think it was 10%. We did a reduction of 10% of our workforce. I laid off my mom, which made me a lot of angry people, family and other people in parts of the ministry. And I did it because I knew that she was pretty comfortable financially at that point, and she didn't need the money, but she took it very personally. But I remember just kneeling before the Lord and saying, Lord, I know it's my fault. I know I brought this on, but I don't know what to do, and I'm helpless. And I was weeping as I was telling this to the board chairman. It was Al Harris, I think, was our board chairman at the time. And Al wisely came back to me, looked back at me and said, Reid, it's not about you. And I said, well, you don't understand. It's my fault. He said, it's not about you. You are wherever God wants you to be right now, and it's okay. Just do what you know to do now and hold on. And that was just such great advice. And we did hold on. And as I prayed and fasted and sought the Lord, I heard him reassuring me that it was going to be okay. But it still took about a year for it to be okay. And that was one of the hardest times I can remember.
So you made the transition to CEO in 85?
Yes.
85. How did you find yourself unprepared for leadership?
Well, my degree was in business management, so I knew, some about accounting and some about leadership and some about other things. I certainly did realize I was not the person of faith that my dad was, or that I thought the leader of Miracle Hill needed to be. I had a challenge with vision, and I did not have nearly enough other leaders around me to be able to lead effectively. And so I think I would have traded a year of my life for an hour's conversation with my father a month after he died, if I could have gotten it. But I just felt really lonely, and like there was nobody I could talk to that could help me sort it out.
How'd you move past it?
There was an older board member, a guy named F.A. Lawton, who was a close friend of my dad's. And
Shout out to CE.
Shout out to CE, our current board chair. He was a close friend of my dad's and became like a second father to me. And so many times when I was just completely stuck, I would just drive up to his house and have a meal with him and talk with him and go back encouraged that I could make it another day. I also, my father's brother, Merle Lehman, was a pastor in Indiana, and he was just finishing college when I started in college, so I knew him pretty well and felt pretty comfortable with him. And about 3 months after Dad died, I drove up to Indiana and asked him if he would consider leaving the pastorate and coming to work at Miracle Hill and sort of taking leadership role in the children's home. And 9 months later, he felt the call and came down. I wasn't nearly so lonely and hurting then, but it was still a great help, and we worked together for many years.
So one of the kind of philosophies that we have is this idea of being non-toxic. So tell our listeners, what is toxic charity, and how do we maintain being non-toxic, and then how do you as a leader stay from being toxic?
So I think we would view toxic charity as providing help to people in ways that helps keep them stuck where they're at. That doesn't provide an incentive or a path for them to grow into a healthier life and a healthier future. We always, I think, had non-toxic elements of our organization, but until we were introduced to the book by Robert Lupton on toxic charity, I don't think we were as diligent in just looking at everything to seeing what might be contributing to keeping them where they're at. So the idea, many times a soup kitchen, and soup kitchens can be wonderful things, but if you feed the same person day after day and you never provide them with any incentives to have a better life, are you really helping them, or are you sort of keeping them stuck where they're at? And so we've tried in all parts of the ministry to look and ask, is what we're doing toxic? And should we be doing it all? But if we're going to do it, how do we need to change so it's not toxic?
So, like, it's kind of a convoluted question, but as you're leading, how do you work towards that? How do you ensure that you are leading a ministry that maintains that it's not toxic?
Well, I think first thing you do is look at results. Are you seeing life change, or are you simply racking up numbers? If the people coming through your addiction recovery programs are not any different after they come out, if their relapse rates are the same as everybody else's, I would say that is a toxic addiction recovery program. If your goal is to help eliminate homelessness and the people coming into your shelter never escape it, or very few of them ever escape it, then I would suggest there's something toxic going on in the way you're dealing with them. What is it you need to change that will empower them to become the people that God originally designed them to be?
So I want to focus in more on leadership, and I want to ask you one final question about kind of homelessness. So since 1980, the issue of people experiencing homelessness has certainly grown in the nation. The problem has evolved. Do you believe that homelessness is as a result of broken systems in our world or poor personal choices?
I appreciate so much what Tim Keller said in his book. It's both. The liberal says it's broken systems. The conservative says it's personal choices. And to be honest, there are elements of both. But for those of us who believe that, for those of us who believe in the concept of sin or simply falling short of God's glory, for those of us who believe that God has given us an owner's manual that tells us how we can live, and if we don't live according to his plan and precepts, our life won't work as well, we would focus more on the personal choices or the personal brokenness. Someone mentally ill may not be there because of personal choices. It may be a condition they have no control over, but it's still a personal issue rather than a system issue. So I'm very much in favor of better paying jobs and better access to jobs and better transportation and affordable housing. And we fight for all those things at Miracle Hill. But our focus has been and should continue to be on helping people that experience brokenness find wholeness. Because my experience is that when people become whole, regardless of the system around them, their lives begin to work. And very few of them experience homelessness again.
It's such a complicated conversation, right?
Yeah.
So, issues of poverty, whether it's homelessness or addiction or fill in the blank, once poverty and that level of brokenness seeps into your life, it's in every area of your life,
It is.
right? It's in your finances, in your employment, in your education, in your mental health, in your spiritual health. And how do you unpack that or help someone unpack that? It's very complicated. It typically takes a long time, and it's like peeling an onion, layer by layer by layer, where you may have to help this person's heart issue at the same time that you're helping them navigate this less than perfect system.
Yeah.
Very complicated. Okay, let's focus in on leadership. What does it mean to follow Jesus while you're leading a ministry?
I think many Christian leaders look the part really well, but they don't have the time alone with God that gives them the staying power and the consistency they need to lead effectively. So I don't think, I wish I was a better communicator, and in many ways you are a better communicator than I am, but I don't think effective communication, I don't think looking the part does it. I think it's really getting alone with God and hearing his voice and discovering the spiritual gifts he's put into you and living them out to the very best of your ability. And I don't think it's necessarily one personality type or another. I'm an introvert. You're more of an extrovert than I am, although you've got some introverted tendencies. But I'm glad I don't have to be an extrovert to lead. Leadership is putting one foot in front of the other, doing my best to influence people to follow Christ along with me, and that we have a common mission and a common culture and a common set of spiritual expectations for one another.
And you only get that by spending time with him.
I believe that to be true.
So you talked about the recession in 2008. That was more situational. Do you think you've ever experienced like a dark night of the soul spiritually as you've tried to lead?
Yes, I don't. I'm not naturally prone to depression, so I wouldn't say that I've gone for months, in a depressed state. But there certainly have been times when I've cried out to God and didn't feel that He was hearing me, or if He did, there was no sign of it that I was experiencing. I did learn the principle of fasting, though, and almost always, if I would set aside anywhere from 3 or 4 days to a week or longer to fast and seek Him when I was really, really discouraged, I got to the end of that period of time greatly encouraged. Now, many times in the fast, I would say, Lord, is Miracle Hill going to continue? And a week later, I didn't know, but I was okay if it didn't. I was reassured that God was in charge, and whatever was supposed to happen would happen, and that it wasn't my fault if it didn't happen.
So, what does fasting look like for Reid Lehman? What does that mean to you?
Well, if for some people fasting is eating less or only eating certain things, but if I eat anything, I'm going to overindulge in it. So, for me, it's just water, or for whatever period of time I'm going to do the fast. And sometimes it's a plan that I'm going to fast for a certain number of days and then stop. And sometimes it's a fast, a few times it's a fast that I'm going to fast until I hear an answer, and I'll stop after that. And that's a little more scary because you can't force God to speak. So it may go longer than you intended.
Yeah, and you get real hungry.
Yeah.
And then you stop being hungry, and maybe that's more scary.
Yeah.
Okay, so as you're leading Miracle Hill, you personally are trying to keep the ministry in God's will. But at some point in your maturity, you realize that that's really not leadership, right? That's dictatorial, and you want to help the group to discern God's will together. What does that idea mean to you? So, I think what I thought I believed about leadership in those early years was that Moses goes up on Sinai and comes back with the 10 Commandments, and that certainly was God's plan back then. But I sort of thought that was what leaders did today, and we've been greatly influenced by a book by Ruth Haley Barton called Discerning God's Will Together. But even before we read that book, we began a process for particularly difficult questions of praying and maybe fasting and praying and coming together with the goal not of stating what we wanted to do individually, but just of whatever God was saying to us at that moment as we were asking for His voice. And on a number of occasions, we heard very clear answers from the Lord as a group, and none of us were really hearing a clear answer individually. We heard God speak, and we followed His path even when it didn't make rational sense. And every time we were really glad that we did. So I do believe that in an organization there needs to be a person that the buck stops with them, and they're responsible for being sure things are organized. But it's amazing that sometimes God speaks to the person more clearly who doesn't have a particular place on the organizational chart. And I really want to hear His voice no matter how He speaks. And we spoke to Balaam through a donkey. I hope I don't have to do that. But I certainly don't want to discount another voice just because they don't have a particular role. Yeah, and it can be very uncomfortable from personal experience. So when I became CEO and Reid left being CEO, which was January of 2020, COVID hit, and you and I had, which is now a comedic conversation, where I was crying out that I didn't know what to do, and you said, "I never had a pandemic. I got nothing for you."
After I'd reassured you that you couldn't face anything that I
Right.
hadn't already done.
So then, as COVID picked up speed, our thrift stores went from being profitable to not being profitable. Then they went from not being profitable to losing money. Then the governor shut down our thrift stores, and as a non-contributor to unemployment, that means we had, well over 100 people that went home with pay that we had to pay, and our thrift stores are no longer producing revenue for the ministry. And so, just within a few months, I envisioned completely silly now, but I envisioned that God put me in this position of leadership for Miracle Hill to fold in the first 6 months. And every financial metric would say that was true.
Yeah.
And so, somewhere along the line, I think we had the idea, and you gently prodded that we should do some of these prayer sessions where we just listen to the Lord. And so I know we had several during that time, and I don't remember which one it was. I remember that I was emotionally a wreck. I was the most stressful few months of my entire adult life, especially from a leadership perspective. So we go into this meeting, and there's probably 40 people in the meeting. There's a phone set up for another group of people to listen in. And it was undeniable as we went around the room that people were hearing God say, "Trust and be patient." And so we walked out of that room, and Reid's got this big smile on his face, and he says, "Isn't this great news?" And I was furious. It was so uncomfortable because God was saying, "Don't do anything." And all I wanted to do was do something. And he was saying, "Don't do anything." And you had learned it over decades and were comfortable with it. And it was not comfortable. I didn't hear God saying that. I didn't hear God saying anything. All I heard was alarm bells going off. But it was through these other amazing men and women who were in an emotional and spiritual position to hear from the Lord that we truly did, just in that moment, discern God's will together. And so what did we do? We didn't do anything. We were patient and waited, and man, did I learn a lesson through that.
Yeah.
Right? God provided unbelievably, and we got through it like it never happened. But in the moment, not always a comfortable thing to be in.
And thinking about that, I'll tell you the corollary, and that is that when I host those sessions, I feel like I often hear less than anybody else around me. And as the leader, you didn't hear it, but I think we both knew God was speaking through these other people.
It made me mad.
Why doesn't he like me well enough to speak through me?
Well, it wasn't that. It was I didn't like his answer. Right? I wanted to do something to help fix the problem.
Yeah.
And he was saying, "Don't do anything." And it made me mad. And it made me mad because it was undeniable that everybody had heard from the Lord. And so I was kind of beholden to not do anything. And
You felt trapped a little bit.
I felt trapped and uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But man, it was the right thing, and it turned out awesome. Okay. Last 5 questions. So first one. In your years of leadership, did you view yourself as a pastor, the president, a counselor, a leader? How did you view yourself?
I do. I think I viewed myself at the beginning as the person in charge, which is probably not the best view. The longer I served, the more I viewed myself as a shepherd. Not as a pastor, not as a CEO. I probably wasn't all that good a CEO, but if I could shepherd the people around me and organize our efforts to serve the Lord, I would be very happy to be called that.
So, what do you think is the big difference between ministry leadership and secular leadership? And do you think that one's more difficult than the other?
I think ministry leadership is more difficult because in secular leadership, you have a proven income stream that results from your company's activities, and you know what metrics to hit, and you pay people accordingly, and everybody gets what they want. In ministry, the people who support you are not the same as the people you're serving. So you're adding additional complexity for any nonprofit organization. But for ministry especially, there are things that you could do that are legal that are not biblical. There are ways you can treat people that are legal that are not what a shepherd should or would do. And you've got to put God's call and the needs of people first above corporate goals, and do right by people. The Bible says we're not crowned unless we strive lawfully. And it doesn't mean unless we obey the laws of South Carolina. It means unless we obey the laws of God, and that results in not just what we do, but how we do it, and doing it with the right spirit.
So I'm changing some of my questions here. What advice would you give to a new ministry leader or a believer that's going into a leadership position? May not be in ministry, but they follow Jesus. And so what advice would you give to a new leader?
I would encourage them to take the amount of time they think they should spend with the Lord and add another 15 or 20 minutes a day to it, and to go in with real humility. Humility won't be hard at first because you don't know what you're doing, but once you know what you're doing, or you think you know what you're doing, that's when you really need humility, because God resists the proud and he lifts up the humble. And so if you want to be effective in the long term, do your very, very best to have a humble heart and a humble spirit. Because, if you do something amazing and everyone thinks that Ryan did something amazing, then God didn't get the glory, and it really is more about Ryan than it is about God.
What are you doing these days?
I'm, when I read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People years ago, I realized that my personal mission had changed, and it was to mentor and grow other Christian leaders. And I get to do that every week. I'm working with 7 or 8 organizations on behalf of Miracle Hill. I'm also serving other gospel rescue missions in other parts of the country, especially working with their boards. And then I do some premarital counseling and some marriage counseling. And when I have extra time, I work with my grandkids, do things with my grandkids, and weld in my shop and go camping with Barbara.
Has it been difficult for you to move on to the next season of life? So I know the answer to this question, but you've got this baby for 30 years. Yeah. Miracle Hill was your child, and then in the blink of an eye, it's not.
Yeah.
Was that difficult?
As you know, I tried this twice, once in 2015 and then again with you in 2020. The first time, it was difficult. I was pleased with my replacement. God had been at work. It seemed like I was sent off with honor, but I was depressed for about 3 months. And it wasn't until I really got started helping these other organizations that Barbara said that she saw a change in me. This time when you took over, I never experienced any of that. I was so relieved to hand the leadership role off again, and especially to someone that I knew was going to cherish it well and handle it well.
Oh, you did not know that at the front end.
You
were prayerful.
I was very prayerful, but and you weren't quite ready, but I felt like you would take counsel well, and you would do well, and you certainly have done well. So no, I haven't had any regrets or any heartburn in this time.
Well, thank you for coming in here and sharing your story. I would love that as we close our time together, would you pray specifically for the men and women that know Jesus that are being called into leadership in various ministries and organizations across the land?
Sure. Heavenly Father, thank you for the chance to talk about you and talk about your work in our lives and in this ministry. Lord, for those out there who are feeling a call, my prayers for them is that they'll just get started. Lord, not to wait until they're ready, but that they'll do what they can to prepare, but they'll step into it, and when they're inadequate, that they will hold more tightly to you, that they will seek your face, that they will listen for your voice, and that they will talk with other godly Christians to help to encourage them and lead them along the way. Thank you, Lord, for the faithful, godly servants at Miracle Hill who do this every day, day in and day out. And I pray especially for those in the front lines, Lord, who every single day are talking with people whose lives are completely out of control and who have no hope when they walk in our doors. And Father, help them not to be weary in well-doing, and bless them richly for their service to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Bye, everybody.